Tax and taxation are not terribly appealing words. They're not exactly your warm, friendly, hearty words that you want to listen to. They're cold, quite alienating and hostile words. But hopefully I'm going to warm you to the concept and talk about tax and specifically Africa. You're probably thinking, hang on, why Africa exactly? Africa has low, medium income countries. Why on earth are we talking about taxation? We should surely be talking about financial assistance and aid on the continent rather than taxation. But actually, taxation is incredibly consequential for African countries. And here's why. Taxation leads to better governance. Governments are money machines. They raise a lot of money and then they spend a lot of money. Where they get their money from and exactly how they get it in the first place is vital in how governments behave. You probably know that the livelihood of a person shapes their behaviour and their personality. The same thing happens for governments. How they get their money and where they get it from defines their behaviour and their personality. So most governments around the world and in the West specifically get the bulk of their money from broad general taxation. Those are quite hefty words. What is broad general taxation exactly? Well, governments that get their money from broad general taxation get it from a large number of individuals and companies in relatively small chunks. But African governments, on average, work very differently. They do get part of their money from broad general taxation, but even more money comes from two other sources. That is to say, development aid on the one hand, and profits gained from the extraction of natural resources, such as gas, oil, and minerals. And actually, the extraction of natural resources is a fast-growing industry in Africa. So as I say, African governments depend on three sources of income: broad general taxation, aid, and natural resource revenues. But aid and natural resource revenues are actually quite problematic. Governments that depend on these two revenues actually behave in quite a strange way. If the government depends on broad general taxation for its income, it has a common interest with taxpayers, that is to say, its citizens and their prosperity. Governments that depend on broad general taxation have an urge, a motivation to promote economic growth. If they depend on general taxation, they will try and seduce their citizens to encourage them to pay tax voluntarily. And in return, they will offer citizens better educational systems, better roads, better ports, better health services, in short, better infrastructure. And if people are paying a significant amount of money in tax to their governments, they are themselves more likely to say, wait a minute, the government is taking our money. What on earth is it doing with our money? They're more likely to mobilise and get organised to find out exactly what is happening to their funds, to their money, and want to control what happens to it. So taxation is supportive of basic democratic principles. In other words, it's the material support, the fabric for participation and relative transparency. Dependence on taxation is simply a very good thing. But sadly, there are many examples of the contrary on the African continent. The most dramatic example is Nigeria. Nigeria is the biggest country in Africa, And in the 1990s, the Nigerian government started to extract large amounts of oil. This meant that it stopped taxing its citizens altogether and became a largely corrupt government. One solution to this corruption would be to fund governments with tax rather than aid. In other words, it would be better for this type of government that gets its income from oil, gas, and minerals to not have discretion on how they use their money. It would be better if they were to transfer the money to citizens automatically, and if the government wants to use this money, then they should tax their citizens in order to get the money. This would mean that there would be more participation and more transparency. So could a healthy system of taxation actually easily be established in Africa? The simple answer is no, certainly not easily, and definitely not anytime soon. There's also a longer answer, and I'll give it to you now. In the West, we pay taxes on the things we buy, on the money that we earn and that we make. Our society, as we know it, can't function without taxation. So a company makes a product, people buy the product, and the company makes a profit. The company, in return, has to pay a tax bill to the national government. And this money, in taxes, is then used to fund public services, to give infrastructure to citizens. But actually, this doesn't happen in many, many circumstances, specifically in Africa. Instead of paying their tax bills, companies in Africa, and specifically foreign multinationals based in Africa, find technically legal, but also very sneaky ways of avoiding paying taxes. And this simply sucks the lifeblood out of countries that don't have money to pay for schools, hospitals, and other types of infrastructure. In developing countries with poor or rural populations, collecting taxes is expensive anyway for the government, and it's unaffordable for a majority of citizens who mostly work in informal economy. So a lot of the tax is actually expected to come from multinationals, from the investment that developing countries have on African soil. But a lot of this money actually goes through tax havens, and so the money is not given to the governments locally. So I'll give you 3 examples of tax avoidance. The first one is in Mazabuka, which is in Zambia. Mazabuka is home to Africa's largest sugar mill. This mill is called Zambia Sugar, and is owned by Associated British Foods. Ever since 2007, it's made a profit of approximately $123 million. $123 million, that's a staggering amount. The company admits to having paid, and I quote, virtually no corporation tax on this. Instead, the company decided to move large amounts of its payments through tax havens, such as Ireland, Mauritius, and the Netherlands. So the amount that Zambia Sugar has avoided paying in tax since 2007 is roughly $27 million. And that amount would have been enough to put 48,000 Zambian children in schools. So the money could have been used to invest in education, but also healthcare, and also simply ensure that local people have enough money to feed themselves. The second example is from 2007 and involves Vodafone. We all know Vodafone as one of the biggest telecom providers in the world. It decided to buy Hutchinson Essa, which is an Italian subsidiary of a Hong Kong-based company. Hutchinson Essa, despite only actually operating in India, is not based there. It's registered in the Cayman and Virgin Islands, which is also a tax haven in the Caribbean. So Vodafone bought the company through one of its own subsidiaries, which was registered in the Netherlands, which is also a tax haven. In other words, Vodafone managed to not have to pay any tax by buying this Indian subsidiary. And it managed to not pay $2.2 billion. $2.2 billion would have been the amount of the entire annual budget for meals of school children in India. So it's also a staggering amount. The last example is this time on a larger geographical scale because it spreads across the African continent. ActionAid carried out an investigation in 2013 on a company called Tullow Oil. And Tullow Oil had only 4 of its 81 subsidiary companies registered in African countries. 47 instead were registered in tax havens. So again, Tullow Oil essentially managed to avoid paying taxes. So governments in poor countries are not benefiting from money that they could otherwise receive from multinational companies. And this money could be used to fund primary school education, to give access to healthcare, to tackle infectious diseases, and to invest in farming and food production to help hunger problems in the developing world. So to conclude, we've discussed 2 broad concepts. First of all, the general benefits of good taxation systems, and secondly, the effects that tax avoidance can have on low and medium income countries. Healthy tax systems are based on a healthy relationship between governments, businesses, and citizens. And tax is really the bedrock for democracy and economic growth. When businesses or citizens decide to not pay taxes, money is taken away from countries, and money that could be invested for pensions or security services and other healthcare benefits. Thank you.